Hi guys, in this video I'm going to go through some updates that I've been making to this project which I'm calling Calimoe. So what this is, if you didn't watch the first one, this is kind of like a little library that I'm creating for Monogame alongside my projects. And the idea is that this is going to have some kind of utilities that sit on top of Monogame that make things a little bit easier. And so with every game, this is going to kind of be refactored and expanded upon. So there's quite a bit that I've done. So I'm coming towards the end of Orberella now, and I've done quite a bit of working here. So one of the things that I added, which was new, was my primitives class. Now this is something that a lot of other libraries have put in, and I've only just put in just a couple of functions which are going to be useful for me, but this is something that could be expanded later on. So usually with Monogame, when you create textures, you would load them from the content pipeline. And one thing that I noticed was kind of missing earlier on in Monogame was how do you just draw a rectangle or draw a line on the screen? It's not there. But what you can do instead is you can simply create a texture directly from the graphics device, which is just a pixel, and it's got various formats. And if you just give it a format of a color, then what that's going to do is create a texture which is basically a 1 by 1 pixel based in that color. We set it to white, and so that simply creates a texture which is a simple 1 by 1 white pixel, and then you can do all sorts of things with it. So the next thing there is to draw a line. So the basic thing here is that you have two vectors. So a vector is like an X and a Y. So if you've got two vectors, if you think of them as being on a plane, you could draw a line between those two vectors. So you need to calculate the distance. You've got a function in there that does that for you. And similarly with the angle, you've got the tangent there, which calculates that for you. And so then this simply calls the second drawLine function to actually do the drawing. So this is simply drawing the pixels in between there with the settings that you've got configured. So then the natural thing for me then was to draw a rectangle, which is simply drawing 4 lines. The top, the left, the bottom, and the right is the way I've done that. And this was used in Orberella. So this was something that I showed in the last devlog that I did for Orberella, where I was drawing a rectangle around the bounding boxes in red, so you could clearly see the bounding box for each object, and that allowed me to find quite a nasty collision bug. So the next thing that I've done is quite a big rework of this game object idea. So I've got a game object, and then deriving from that I've got a sprite object and a text object. Now the idea with this is that as long as I'm developing simple games that don't have thousands of objects, I've only got a handful of objects, I want to use this kind of object-oriented structure to represent them. This works fine as long as the game is fairly small in scope and doesn't have too many different types of object. And what this does is this just wraps a little bit of the functionality in the base class so that I've got less work to do in my derived classes, and so that I can write my code in a more consistent way. So a game object here is basically something which can be drawn to the screen. So as a minimum, it's going to have a position, a scale, it's going to have a color, and then it's going to have a bounding rectangle to show where it appears on the screen. And what I've done here is the update bounds that has to be implemented by the derived classes. And then the other really important thing, and this is the part which I've had to refactor, is that every object should have update and draw defined in the exact same signature as they are in the Monogame loop. So I first wrote these 3 classes, the game object, sprite object, and text objects, when I was first starting out with my Pong game. And the problem there was that at the time, I still hadn't quite got my head around the main game loop, the update draw cycle, which happens in every single frame. And I was calling all sorts of different functions. I had update with various parameters passed in it. I was in my text, I had like draw text and all sorts of things like that, which were basically horrible. And it's not until I really got my head around, no, that's not how it's supposed to work, that I was able to refactor this. So the idea is that any object can update itself, any object can draw itself. And so I've had to do quite a bit of work here to refactor these. So for example, the sprite object, actually this is a sprite object, I've still got some more refactoring to do. So this is an example of the kind of thing that I want to take off. So here I've got a function draw flipped horizontally and draw flipped vertically. What I want to do instead is have a property that you can set to say whether or not it's flipped, and then it simply changes the call to draw. So this is something I still need to take out and change. The text object, this was similar. So I've still got a function here to do centering, but I was passing in sort of weird objects and I was just doing it in a strange way. And what I wanted to do instead was simply say, right, you can call this is going to be centered, and then it simply does it automatically in the draw. So this is what I've got now, and I've managed to refactor I've refactored both games for this, though Pong still needs to be refactored to use the sprite objects. Sorry, not the sprite objects, the game objects for its other parts. At the moment it's broken. But I've been doing a lot of work on Orberella for this. So functionally, Orberella hasn't actually changed, but there's been a lot of work behind the scenes refactoring things. I still need to do some more. And this is something that I'm going to do with every project. I'm going to get the basics of the game done and then kind of refactor as I go along to try to make it easier for then the next game. So another little thing that I've done with my text is if I just basically lose the game very, very quickly on Orberella. So as soon as this fills up, we lose. So what I've got here is, at first I had drawn this game over text in a paint program and imported it in and drew it as literally a PNG, but I thought, no, I don't want that. I want this as text. So one of the things that I did was I wanted to be able to scale this up. So I've simply done that in my sprite font, I've got it quite small, and then I simply set the scale property to 3. So that scales it up, which makes it look kind of pixelized. But what I wanted was this shadow effect. I don't know if you can see, there's just a slight shadow with the black. And at first I had kind of done that manually just to get it working. But now what I've done is within my text object on Calimoe, you can simply set a property of shadow, set it to true. By default it's black with a thickness of 5, and then if you wanted to you could configure it to be something different. So in Orberella this is really just now one line of code. So if I turn the shadow off, I haven't actually tested this. I really should test things before I do videos. So hopefully now, yeah, there we go. So that's just the orange text now without the shadow. So you can see obviously it looks a lot better with the shadow, but I wanted that in a base class so I could do that same kind of effect in other games. So now I've got that, and that's the whole point of this library. Now I know that there's lots of other libraries around. There's lots of existing libraries for Monogame, but for me, I'm doing all of this as a learning exercise. I want to teach myself this stuff, so I'm not trying to compete with any of those libraries. I'm not trying to re-implement what they're doing. I'm just putting in what works for me so that I can learn from it, and then with each game I'll be refactoring and building this out and improving on it, bit by bit by bit by bit. So that is all I've got for this at the moment. So another thing that I've added today to my library is a little utility class for a clock. And so what this represents is like an in-game clock. So you initialize it with 3 different variables. You give it a start time and an end time, and then in real time how long that should take. The easiest way to show this working is to actually show it in the game. So what I wanted here was in Orberella to have it so that you play the game during a certain time, and once the time hits, so in this case I've actually got this the wrong way around, that's for testing. I want it to start at 9 PM and then finish at 6 AM. That would represent sort of one like level. Now I've got this on really fast, so if I just do this like 0.2, that's going to go in just literally a few seconds. So you can now see this clock running at the top. So the actual clock text, I've got put that in Orberella, that's not part of the clock class. But once that hits 6 o'clock, it should stop and then hopefully tell me I've completed the level. Yeah. So what I would do in actuality is probably have this as something like 5 minutes. I don't really know what kind of duration to do, but basically the clock will just, you know, act however you want it to act. You can have it any kind of time, so I could have it starting at like, I don't know, 2 p.m. until 3 p.m. And then have that as, again, just like a few seconds. And so that should, you know, tick up very, very quickly and just stop at 3 o'clock. There we go. So yeah, just a useful little utility that I'm sure I'm going to use in many different games. So yesterday I was working on a new feature for Orberella and it was really buggy, and I've eventually traced it down to yet another bug with bounding boxes, which came down to this Calimoe library again, this sprite object. And I had something wrong here in the updating of the bounds, and it was just being an absolute pain in the ass. And I felt like I have spent hours over the past 2 or 3 days dealing with bugs which all come down to this one class. And at some point yesterday I was really tempted to just abandon this and just basically use someone else's library, you know, like drop in a class from Monogame Extended or something like that. But I thought, no, the whole reason I'm doing this is to kind of teach myself to learn. So yeah, hopefully this sprite is now robust. But yeah, like I said earlier on in the video, I'm doing this as kind of like a learning exercise for myself here, and so that's really the only reason I'm doing it. It's not particularly good class, not, you know, none of this stuff is going to be particularly good, but it's something that I can learn as I develop my games. So that's all I've got to say about Calimoe for now. This isn't something that I'm going to do videos on very often, because most of what I'm going to be putting out there is the game devlogs. You know, this isn't particularly interesting stuff, but yeah, this is where I'm at with it at the moment. So thanks very much for watching, guys. I'll speak to you next time.